This is hell.
South Africa's worst violence in decades has led to hundreds dead. The violence happened immediately following the jailing of former President Jacob Zuma for refusing to comply with an investigation into allegations of corruption. But was this an orchestrated uprising against Zuma's detention by his supporters, or was it a spontaneous explosion of looting and rioting fueled by poverty, inequality, food shortages, and inaccessibility to the basic necessities of life? Or could it be both? Here to help us understand exactly what is happening in South Africa, South African writer Niall Reddy wrote the AfricaIsACountry.com article, A Terrifying Vision of South Africa's Future. Welcome to This Is Hell, Niall.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. Great to be here.
You can follow Niall on Twitter at @red_Niall. You write that predicting a major political shockwave has been standard fare among South African pundits for some time. The sheer depth of the socioeconomic crisis in the country, best encapsulated by a broad unemployment rate of 42%, made it something of a safe bet. Why does South Africa have such high unemployment? Is there a singular problem that drives unemployment, like access to a quality education or job training? Because I got to tell you, Niall, yesterday I put that question into Google and I said, why does South Africa have such high unemployment? The first answer back was lack of an education. Is that the real root cause of the high unemployment rate in South Africa?
Look, I mean, there's no simple answer to the question, but I could tell you that answer, the one that Google gave you, is pretty far off the mark. If we're going to try to narrow it down to anything, lack of education, I think, is definitely one of the lesser drivers of what's happening in the economy. It's the explanation that tends to be favored by the business community, by large-scale capital in particular, because it's an explanation that I think helps them to divert from the bigger structural changes that are actually needed to get out of this economy. So they tend to want to set up the unemployment problem as essentially a supply side problem, that we're not producing the right skills, we're not giving them enough engineers and STEM graduates, et cetera. If we just did that, then the market would be able to function perfectly according to its own logic. There wouldn't need to be any kind of concerted state intervention. We just need to fix this one supply side question and things will be back on track. The reality is it's a hell of a lot more complicated than that. It is very much a deep-rooted legacy of the economic structure that we had under apartheid, in which you had a very capital-intensive, mining-driven economy dominant in South Africa, that was then drawing labor out of these reserves into which most of the black population had been pushed. And then what happened was when the ANC comes to power, and as your listeners will probably know, it came to power at the time. It had a very sort of social democratic orientation itself. It comes into power in alliance with the main trade union movement and the Communist Party. It looks like it's going to implement some kind of progressive distributive agenda and gets very quickly pushed in a very different direction through the combined effort of local capital and international capital, ends up adopting a quite orthodox neoliberal program. And this effectively just guts the economy. You have the winds of foreign competition just blow through and create enormous destruction, uproot the manufacturing industry. And so you suddenly have unemployment shooting up immediately in the post-apartheid period. At the same time as these form of the Bantustans, these reserves in which the African population had been held, are now suddenly supplying a hell of a lot more labor. But because we're in this low growth, deindustrializing neoliberal framework, it just has no capacity to absorb that labor. And so unemployment climbs steadily up until around 35, 36% is what it was, what it's been at over the last sort of decade and a half. And then when the COVID crisis hits, it puts it right up to 42%. And that's about 75% amongst people younger than 28. So just a complete inability of the economy to absorb this level of labor. And so kind of permanent exclusion is what is the condition of a giant section of the population.
Do you think when a country does institute neoliberalism, Do you think that is it's a typical response of any criticism of neoliberalism is, well, we just lack education and therefore we cannot produce what we need to produce to have a vigorous economy? Is that a typical excuse when we hear, for instance, during the Obama administration or during the Biden administration, during the Trump administration, whenever they say the problem is education and a lack of job training, do you think that is just an intentional excuse to obfuscate the responsibility that neoliberalism has for the downturn in the economy?
I mean, I think it certainly fulfills that function. Look, I think a lot of the people putting this argument across are true believers in it, right? They're ideologues of a certain kind. I don't think they're being deliberately disingenuous when they claim this. But it certainly does have that convenient function and it's funny because it creates a lot of confusion because in the business press, what they talk about this as structural reforms. They say there's structural problems with the economy, but what they mean is simply this, that there's a supply side issue around education. And you're totally right that it's not, this is not just an argument that we hear in South Africa, it's all over the world. This tends to be a convenient way out, a convenient way of not really having to address deeper root causes. In the US, of course, it's deployed also as an argument against inequality. Why do you have massive inequality? Well, we just haven't given certain people the right jobs. But in reality, I mean, the education problem would resolve itself fairly quickly. Look, I'm not saying that, it wouldn't help to have a better education system, but the reality is that the jobs are just not being supplied in South Africa. And in fact, one of the things that gives a lie to this narrative is that there's even pretty high rates of unemployment amongst graduates, and amongst graduates specifically of those kinds of disciplines that would supposedly be useful for industrializing economy. And so it certainly fulfills this function, whether or not they're doing it, whether or not they're doing it in an entirely cynical way or just because this is what their ideology tells them, I guess is a more complicated issue.
Does the African National Congress, does the ANC, well, first of all, did they have a choice when it came to going down the path of neoliberalism? And do they currently have a choice? Could they abandon neoliberalism without having a horrible, after blowback from the international community on their economy?
I mean, they certainly had a choice. Let's be frank, it was an extremely difficult position that they were faced with at the time that they came to power. This was a period of real triumphalism for global neoliberalism. It was shortly in the wake of the collapse of the Soviet Union. It was a period where there were few international allies for the ANC to have crafted this left agenda. But at the end of the day, it wasn't the case that the ANC pushed as hard as it could have against these external constraints and then found them unable to bend them and therefore fell into a neoliberal program. In fact, it was a much more complicated process where one wing of the ANC had already decided before liberation, that was the wing under Thabo Mbeki, who was the guy who took over from Nelson Mandela, that there was no real alternative to globalizing the economy. They'd made this decision beforehand. There wasn't a significant base in the ANC that was a sort of middle-class, upwardly mobile base that very quickly realized that they had no stake in creating disruption and in scaring away capital by pushing a dangerous economic policy of redistribution. And so there was certainly, it was not the case that it was just external constraints that held the party down. There was a big section of the party that actually actively adopted this strategy and decided it would be in their own interest to do so. And then the real tragedy was that the left in the alliance, the tripartite alliance that's between the trade union COSATU and the South African Communist Party, was just never effective at resisting this. They just were not prepared enough, did not have the right strategy, and then very quickly had a lot of their own key figures co-opted into the state and co-opted into this new neoliberal regime that got set up. And so there was never really effective internal opposition against the ANC from the inside. Does the ANC have an alternative, a choice again today? Absolutely it does. And I think this is, one of the tragedies of the road that it's taking at the moment is that we are in a moment where neoliberalism globally is losing its sheen. The legitimacy of the neoliberal order is crumbling, whether or not neoliberalism itself goes with it. There's clearly an opening to begin all sorts of other experiments with more interventionist policies, an opening that is being seized by many countries around the world. at the same time as the ANC government is cleaving to the most orthodox kind of neoliberalism and implementing a very vicious austerity program that is completely out of step with how most countries are responding to this crisis. And again, it's a significant tragedy because the ANC, still conceives of itself as a left party. It still talks about wanting to set up a developmental state. It's still under its own official program as the National Democratic Revolution, where it's trying to democratize the state and redistribute wealth, etc., in order to prepare the road for a more fundamental transformation down the line. But its policies completely do not align with it. And we're really seeing the depth of the neoliberal conversion of at least one section of the party, given the fact that there is this kind of global opening to be experimenting with other things. And yet South Africa is almost an outlier in the extent to which it's choosing not to experiment with anything. And it's choosing to implement a very conventional austerity program in a situation where we're in this catastrophic economic crisis that, again, is symbolized by this unemployment rate of 42%. So certainly there's a choice.
And you write how the violence immediately followed the jailing of former President Jacob Zuma, the man arguably most responsible for the parlous state of those social services, as you point out. Al Jazeera reported Zuma was ordered to serve a 15-month term for refusing to testify to a commission probing state corruption under his presidency from 2009 to 2019. Why refuse to testify? How politically partisan or politically independent is the commission probing state corruption?
It's completely independent. No serious question about that. The commission was set up by Zuma himself. His ostensible reason for not testifying, the excuse he tried to give, was that he claimed the judge running the commission was biased against him. But this was completely spurious. He had no evidence whatsoever to base that. So why he didn't choose to testify? I mean, he knew that it would be a, further public relations disaster for him. He would get skewered. It would be hugely embarrassing. And so there's some debate as to whether this was his own decision or whether it was terrible legal advice that pushed him to do this. Whatever exactly was going on in his head, he just decided that he's not going to pitch up for this commission. It seemed like, on the whole, a disastrous strategy because it was inevitable it would end up where it did. I mean, he was just very clearly in contempt of court. It was a matter of time before the Constitutional Court came down on him, which is exactly what they did. And so he's found himself in jail, ended up being a lot earlier than he expected. So, I mean, he's in jail just for these contempt of court charges. But of course, he's up against a raft of very serious corruption charges stretching back decades and decades. And so he's facing serious jail time at one point or another. He's ended up bringing it forward a hell of a lot. If we could try to come up with some rationale, if we could try to suss what exactly he was thinking, there's some possibility that he just decided, look, there's only way he avoids jail in the long term is through a political strategy. And so he has to give everything to try and maintaining his support and not losing any credibility. And so he thought, here's the trade-off. If I go to this commission, it's going to cost me politically. And so I'm going to avoid that at all costs, even if it means there's a chance I go to jail for a short period earlier on. That might be the rationale. It could just be that, he's sort of delusional. He got bad legal advice. Who knows? Either way, it seems not to have worked out very well for him.
Yesterday, Al Jazeera also reported that former South African President Jacob Zuma will be allowed out of jail next week to attend a long-running corruption case in person rather than by video link. These are charges that are unrelated to the other charges that he's in jail for right now. Zuma faces 16 charges of fraud, graft, and racketeering related to the 1999 purchase of fighter jets, patrol boats, and equipment from 5 European arms firms when he was deputy president. Is his refusal to testify to the Commission on Corruption related to these other 16 charges of fraud, graft, and racketeering that Zuma also faces?
Yes. I don't know exactly what the commission was going to interview him about, because this commission is specifically about the corruption that occurred during his tenure as president. It's in commission into what we call in South Africa state capture. We give it that name because it gives you an indication of just the extent to which the corruption ultimately went. And at the center of it was Zuma and then this family of Indian businessmen, the Guptas, which is why we sometimes refer to their faction as Zupta, combination of these names. And what it ended up happening was Zuma had essentially handed over certain functions of the state to this family of business people. They were literally appointing cabinet ministers. They were summoning cabinet ministers to their private residence and giving them direct orders on which contracts to allow, which tenders to take out, etc. And so this is why we call it state capture. It's literally privatizing certain functions of the state. So that's the main focus of this commission. Zuma's own history of corruption, as you just mentioned, goes way further back than then, from the time he was deputy president under Thabo Mbeki. And the real high point of it was this 100 billion rand arms deal that took place in the late 1990s that various people describe as a kind of original sin of the ANC. It was this first big orgy of corruption that took place around all these various arms deals, and he was right at the center of that. And it was that case that actually then got him deposed as deputy president in 2005, as these corruption charges were leveled against him. Thabo Mbeki, who saw him as a threat, used that as a pretense to have him removed from the ANC. He then somehow managed to set himself up as the head of a coalition of the aggrieved against Thabo Mbeki, most of which were animated by opposition to Mbeki's very neoliberal policies. Mbeki was seen really as the architect of the neoliberal turn in the ANC. And he was a very kind of autocratic ruler internally within the ANC, respectful democracy generally in the country, but he was quite authoritarian, undemocratic in terms of how he managed the ANC itself. And so it faced a lot of opposition by the end of his second tenure. And so you have this coalition coming together that's really driven by the left in the ANC, the Communist Party, the Youth League that was under its radical leader at the time, Malema, and the trade unions. And Zuma, despite not having any left-wing credentials himself, no history of supporting progressive policies whatsoever in his tenure in power, manages to put himself at the head of this coalition. And this is how he then deposes Zuma and then comes to power in the ANC in 2007. And managed to just evade those corruption charges dating back from the 90s, in part because there was evidence of political interference into the charges brought against him. And so he never had to answer for those, whilst he then gets involved in the most excessive kind of kleptocracy during his tenure as president. And now there's been some kind of resolution to the issues around those initial set of charges. So now he's facing two sets of charges related firstly to that initial round of corruption and then the corruption that he was involved in during his presidency.
You also point out that there is a general consensus that the unrest had two main facets. On the one hand, a seditious campaign waged by Zuma-aligned elements, as you point out, called Zupta, intended to sow instability. On the other, a more spontaneous attempt by desperate people with little or no connection to Zupta to secure food and basic necessities, a bread riot. But that consensus breaks down on the question of how to understand the interrelation of these facets and the relative importance of each in the overall arc of events, and thus how to characterize the episode as a whole. Most commentators have tended to strongly foreground one side or the other. If there, as Ramaphosa, Cyril Ramaphosa, who is the current president of South Africa, as he was deputy president under Zuma, how complicit is the current president in the problems leading to food insecurity and inaccessibility of basic necessities that happened during the Zuma administration? Or does he have no responsibility to those policies whatsoever?
I mean, he's as complicit as anybody, I suppose. He's he's been a high-ranking member of the ANC, as you said, for a long period. He was a deputy president. He never did anything in his period in power to contest the policies that were responsible for the social crisis that's now exploded in the country. And then since he's come to power, he's done certain good things in trying to wind back this period of state capture and trying to recover and repair state institutions and to wage a battle against this very kleptocratic faction of the ANC. On the other hand, he's just doubled down, as we said, on the ANC's kind of orthodox macroeconomic neoliberal policies. And it's those that are ultimately responsible for the unemployment and for the deprivation that allowed this explosion to occur. So absolutely, he bears complicity in it.
So, I mean, that's kind of weird that he's also then telling people that this is an insurrection. And so it would seem like it's an insurrection against his own policies, correct?
Well, I mean, he would say the insurrection is driven by Zuma supporters that are not targeting his economic policies or not really even targeting Ramaphosa himself, but it's just opposition to Zuma having been jailed. They're also claiming, of course, that there's political interference in the jailing and that it's Ramaphosa fighting his own factional battles, which there's no real evidence. I mean, I think all of this was by the book. This was Zuma falling afoul of the law on his own terms. So he would say that's what's driving the insurrection. I mean, we should say he did fight quite hard within the ANC to make that the dominant label of what's happened in this unrest, that it was an insurrection, it was a targeted campaign, it didn't come out of nowhere. There were people driving this with a certain agenda, which I think is correct as far as it goes. At the same time, neither he nor any serious commentator has doubted that the reason it reached the scale that it did was because it was unrest that took place on the basis of this profound social crisis that we're faced with, and that it essentially unleashed all of this existing desperation and disaffection in the society. So there's no question that we could understand what happened without having the social crisis in the background. I don't think he's really tried to deny that. If you go and look up the first address that he gave in the week during the unrest, I think it was on the Tuesday or the Wednesday, he very clearly foregrounded this issue. Since then, his main response to the unrest, along with trying to clamp down on some of the instigators, has been he's made very strong positive moves in favor of a basic income grant. And in fact, they've already extended the emergency cash grant that was rolled out for COVID, which they had cut off a few months before. That was the other kind of immediate contextual factor here, was that this grant that at least been giving some kind of lifeline to all of these people thrown out of unemployment because of the COVID crisis had been cut off in a very cruel way in May as a result of this very ultra-Orthodox neoliberal finance minister that Ramaphosa has appointed. But so they've announced that that'll be extended, and it looks like they are going to implement a permanent basic income grant. We don't know at what level or exactly how it'll be funded, etc. There's all sorts of more or less progressive forms that the thing can take. But I mean, I think the fact that they're pushing hard for big is, again, an indicator that they are acknowledging that this is a political campaign, but one that was made effective because it was able to harness genuine grievances in the society resulting from this socioeconomic crisis. And there's really a consensus on that. There's no commentator that seriously doubts that this is a major factor of what's involved here.
The last time I checked, I think that the percentage of people who have been vaccinated in South Africa was below 4%. To what has been the impact of COVID-19 on the way that people feel about the African National Congress, how they feel about the ruling party of the ANC?
That's going to be an interesting question to see. We tend not to have very good survey data in the country, so I don't have a clear picture of that yet. The lockdowns certainly have been very unpopular. South Africa has had several very stringent, quite punitive lockdowns. The initial lockdown actually was one of the more violent, aggressive lockdowns in the world. There was a massive deployment of troops, and there were quite a few instances of serious abuse and atrocities committed by these troops in controlling the population. Didn't really succeed at all in containing the spread of the virus, I think in part just because of the spatial dynamics in the society. You have such a huge portion of the population concentrated in very dense informal settlements where there's multiple families to small shacks, multiple people in one room, and then the whole community dependent on a kind of threadbare infrastructure, all using the same tap, etc. No real way you can effectively social distance in those conditions. And so these lockdowns have been at the same time very punitive, very harsh on the economy. That's why we've had this massive spike in unemployment, even though it was already up these astronomical levels. And then not even really effective on their own terms. So they've certainly generated a lot of anger. And that anger, I think, peaked once the minimal level of social support that had been provided to people through these cash transfers was then stripped away from them. And so the lockdowns themselves are terribly unpopular. How is that going to affect the ANC? I think it's going to continue to chip away at its support. But, as an observer of South African politics for a while, I've come to realize that it's one of the most dangerous predictions to make, to think that anything is going to suddenly lead to any dramatic shift in the ANC's support. The ANC is just, for reasons we can get into, had an incredibly resilient base of loyalty in the society. And this is going to, I think, push the decline in its support further. It has been declining now solidly for the last 5 or 10 years. But exactly how big of an impact, how much is it going to create mistrust in the Ramaphosa administration? That's nothing I could give you any certain answer on yet.
You mentioned a couple of pieces, a couple of commentary pieces. One at the South African website New Frame, another one that appeared at Jacobin, and both seem to want to say either this was a completely orchestrated event, all the violence following the jailing of President Zuma, former President Zuma, or that it's completely spontaneous. None of them consider the fact that it could be both, as you do, which is one of the most fascinating things about your article. What is missed when these events are seen as solely orchestrated or solely spontaneous?
Right. I mean, I think there are certain agendas that are driving one or other of these two more extreme interpretations. I think the Fogel piece is less guilty of that. New Frame, right from the start of the riots, seemed to be straining quite heavily to try and portray these as mostly a spontaneous bread riot, and essentially to downplay the role of active orchestration in driving this unrest. And I think there's a lot of downsides to that. I mean, in the first place, I think it's just factually inaccurate. We are not yet in a position to have a very clear picture of exactly what was the degree of orchestration and the degree of spontaneity. But certainly past the first few days, what seemed to emerge is it became quite clear that orchestration was a very important role in what happened. That there was a very significant role played in particular by local branches of the ANC that were supportive of Zuma in actively mobilizing the initial people to take steps to create this unrest, and then in creating an environment in which other non-aligned people saw an opportunity to jump in and get involved in the looting. So, and one of the things that I think ultimately registered the importance of this dynamic is that the unrest was mostly confined to areas in which Zuma-aligned forces had some kind of influence, and particularly influence through ANC branches. So it was very much concentrated in KZN, and then it spread into Gauteng, that's the province in which Johannesburg is based, the main kind of economic hub. But it did so primarily through the hostels. The hostels are these large housing complexes that were initially set up for migrant laborers, migrant mine workers in particular, and manufacturing workers, and continue now to host a lot of migrant workers from KwaZulu-Natal, many of whom are Zulu and are supporters of Jacob Zuma. And so it was through their access to networks in these hostels that they were able to then create an initial spread of the unrest into Gauteng. So there's that. The evidence is quite clear that there was this very active orchestration by these local branches. And then the second thing is that there is all these other reports of targeted attacks on infrastructure of various kinds, food supply chains, a chemical plant, ammunition depots, transport infrastructure, etc. That points to instigators trying to unfurl a strategic plan to try to maximize the instability that is caused by this unrest. Okay, so even supposedly attacks on communication infrastructure as part of this. And so all of these things suggesting that clearly what was happening here was not a purely spontaneous event. There was planning and coordination going on in this. There's another very interesting article that's come out today on Africa as a country. I would encourage your listeners to go and read it, by a friend of mine, Ryan Brunette, where he also points out that there's some confusion, I think, in this discussion that's caused by drawing this opposition between instigators and then the masses on the streets. In fact, the Zuma faction that was driving this thing is itself some kind of mass political phenomena, right? It's a political machinery that has a fairly substantial base in a section of the ANC who are supporters of Zuma, and that has links to all sorts of other kinds of criminal organizations, business organizations, civil society organizations, etc. And so I think what we saw here was the mobilization of this machinery, which itself has, I say, some kind of mass basis. It wasn't just 10 or 12 individual instigators lighting flames here. This was a mobilization that was effectuated, but then clearly created conditions in which it then drew in a huge mass of people who had no direct stake in this political fight, but just saw an opportunity now to use the unrest and the looting to serve basic needs that they had. So it was both of these things going on. I think the importance of keeping both of the two things in mind, firstly, it's just a matter of really getting an understanding of what happened here, but it's going to affect the conclusions that we are going to draw from this. If we think what happened was a purely spontaneous bread riot, that tells you something different about the political mood of working class people in the country. It tells you that we are on the verge of a bigger breakdown in the political order than that we've currently seen. And it tells you that we should expect, as this crisis persists, which is likely to do for the medium term at least, that we're going to see occurrences like this happening in other parts of the country, and this is going to keep happening. There's going to be these spontaneous bouts of serious unrest. Whereas if we point more to the active role of this legitimation and orchestration, it gives you a slightly more moderated view of exactly how tenuous the situation is in other parts of the country. So I think that's one important thing. Another important thing is just that I think we have to understand what's going on here, because we also have to have an appreciation of who these forces are that we're up against. And one of the tendencies I've been critical on the left, I think, is in driving this line of saying that it's a purely spontaneous, it's a bread riot, is that it seems to once again sideline the importance of what we're seeing in terms of this very corrupt network, very powerful, corrupt political machinery mobilizing itself as an attack on democracy. And I think one of the problems is the left, big sections of the left haven't really come to terms with the threat that is actually posed by these kinds of kleptocratic populist factions in the ANC and outside the ANC. That these are political groupings that are very hostile to the constitutional order in South Africa. And that were they to succeed in coming to power, would pose a serious threat to liberal democracy in the country, and that need to be resisted in a concerted way by left formations. And so I think acknowledging what they've done here and acknowledging the seriousness of this assault on democracy is important for some of the political conclusions and strategies that we're going to draw from this experience.
And as you point out, the unwillingness to give proper attention to the political forces behind mid-July's events appears symptomatic of a widespread failure on the left to take seriously the growing imperilment of our democracy. To you, what explains the South African left's unwillingness to take seriously the growing imperilment of South African democracy? Does the left have blinders on when considering the ANC's threat to democracy? And if so, what explains why the left will not recognize the ANC's threat to democracy?
I'm not entirely sure what explains. I also think, I use the left here in a kind of blanket way. It wouldn't be fair to claim that everybody on the left in South Africa is ignorant of what's happening. I think it's just a result of maybe, let's say, certain kind of ultra-left tendency on certain section of the left. And the tendency has been to say that these struggles emerging in the ANC, but these faction fights emerging, are just two sides of the elite, two sides of the bourgeoisie. And neither of them has anything to do with the working class. What you have is a neoliberal faction against the kind of state capture, kleptocratic faction. But both of these things ultimately are inimical to, real socialism, and therefore it's not something that we should concern ourselves with. I don't know if there's a fundamental reason for why that is. I think it's just a certain ideological inclination on the left. And then coupled with the fact that the left is in a position of weakness at the moment in South Africa, where we just are not effective at having robust debates about this. There's a kind of disparity between the intellectual vibrancy of the left in South Africa and its on-the-ground strength. And we just haven't been as effective as we should have at creating a robust left debate and culture of cross-left discussion in the country. And as a result of this, I think there are just serious kind of ideological weaknesses in the left around, pretty important political questions such as this.
You also point out that as more information is becoming available, it does seem to be pointing to a higher degree of orchestration than appeared to be the case at the start. Leaked WhatsApp messages testify to a very active role played by ANC councillors and other local leaders. They suggest that shopping malls were deliberately targeted because they constituted symbols of, quote, white monopoly capital. Was the insurrection, as the current president calls it, an insurrection by the Zupta against white monopoly capital? How accurate is that statement that it was an uprising against white monopoly capital?
Well, firstly, that statement cannot be accurate because I don't believe white monopoly capital exists. White monopoly capital is the bugbear that was created by this Zupta faction. In fact, the term comes from this publicity agency, Bell Pottinger, this very infamous marketing firm, British marketing firm, that has this notorious history of representing some of the shadiest characters around the world in their political campaigns, going back to Pinochet. So this company took a brief with the Guptas and Zuma at the height of their controversy towards the end of Zuma's tenure. And one of the strategies they came up with was to, so this is kind of the whole optical strategy of the Zupta faction is to claim that they are waging a struggle against continued white domination of the economy and trying to drive forward what they call radical economic transformation. So actually the bigger name for this faction in the ANC is the RET faction, Radical Economic Transformation. So they're essentially appropriating the language and the agenda of the left and claiming that what they're trying to do essentially is to take back the country from so-called white monopoly capitalists. And so the idea is that large-scale capital, big corporations have just remained in the hands of white people, completely dominated by white people, and that the white people have then used their control of the economy to essentially hem the ANC in and to push the democratic project off its railings, right? So the country's still under the control of so-called white monopoly capital. I think this analysis is incorrect because I think that even though it's totally true that whites are overwhelmingly disproportionately represented in and in control of large-scale capital, given their size of the population, which is only 8-9%, there's no sense in which the dominant sections of business are really white capital. And in fact, I've done some research at this, looking at the directorships of big corporations and looking at corporate networks. And what you see there is that there's actually been quite a big diversification of control and the creation and integration of a politically very influential Black bourgeoisie, right? Part of the reason we don't see this often is we focus too much on ownership statistics and trying to understand what's happening in the economy. But in fact, when we look at directorship and we look at really who's in day-to-day control of these organizations, the capitalist class is quite diversified, even large-scale capitalist class, right? So the statement cannot be true in that pure sense that it was against white monopoly capital. But even more generally, it's not, they're just constantly trying to bring up this bugbear of white monopoly capital. But there's no sense in which they could have successfully framed recent events as an attack on white monopoly capital, because that was just so distant from the chain of events that led up to this unrest. I mean, it was quite obvious that what they were reacting to is Zuma's jailing. Of course, they constantly try to claim that Zuma is being victimized by white monopoly capital, that everything happening to him is an indication of the kind of conspiratorial behind-the-scenes power being wielded by white monopoly capitalists. But I don't think that is a narrative that they've been terribly successful in creating traction around. And so this is one of the other features of the strange situation in South Africa, is that Zuma himself, certainly, and the RET faction in general, has been extremely powerful in the ANC. And it's their power within the ANC that makes them, I think, such a threat to democratic institutions in the country. But they're actually, it turns out, not very popular otherwise, right? Outside, Zuma retains kind of just narrow majority popularity in KZN. Outside of that, he has dismal popularity ratings. And the same could be said of all of his allies in the ANC who are aligned to this radical economic transformation state capture project. And so this has been their attempt to give their kind of narrow acquisitive agenda some kind of bigger legitimacy by saying it's this attack on white monopoly capital. But it doesn't seem to be a narrative that's widely believed in the public.
You also write that the situation remains highly fluid, but at the time of this writing, there seems to be a decent chance that the unrest will backfire on the Zupta coalition. But, Niall, can it backfire in a way that actually challenges the dominant nature of the ANC over all levels of South African politics, whether it's top-down or grassroots, bottom-up politics? Can this backfire in a way that actually challenges the ANC's power?
So, I mean, I think it's likely to backfire on that faction of the ANC. Is it likely to backfire on the ANC itself? That is much less clear. And again, in the absence of strong survey data, et cetera, it's hard to predict exactly how this will play out. So on the one hand, it's a major social crisis that wreaked havoc on people's lives, that was extremely distressing, that led to massive social loss of life. It's a crisis in which most people agree the ANC has direct complicity. And so in theory, any event like this should chip away fairly heavily at the ANC's support. The difficulty comes in the fact that people see two different ANCs in a certain sense. And because of this factionalization within it, right? And so there is some chance that it, in effect, has a kind of opposite effect. Because what we saw was, the headline of the article, a terrifying vision of our future, in particular, if these populist kleptocratic forces are able to continue running amok and accruing power, what it might end up doing is causing certain people to want to give stronger support to Ramaphosa because he represents the main line of defense against these kind of groupings taking over the ANC. So he had already been on the front foot in this battle within the ANC. He'd won a string of key victories against this radical economic transformation faction, including the suspension of their leader from his position as the Secretary General of the ANC. And most people are breathing a huge sigh of relief at this because it looked like there was a chance that Ramaphosa actually might get deposed within the ANC, and you might have this grouping once again coming to power and then essentially continuing the project of state capture, but this time with perhaps an even more authoritarian, anti-democratic twist to it. And so there is, I think, a sense among a lot of people of wanting to support Ramaphosa as the main line of defense against this very scary alternative of what the ANC could become if he loses support. So this is one thing. Then the second thing is that because he's taken this welfare rather than repressive response to the unrest, and it seems like his main action is going to be to roll out a basic income grant, that is another thing out of which he might gain some kind of political capital. So on balance, who's to say what exactly effect this is going to have? My guess is it will be, on balance, still something that continues to chip away at the ANC's support. It is on this downward trajectory, the ANC support in the country. And I think this unrest will push that further along, but I don't think it's going to be any kind of dramatic inflection point just yet.
One last question for you, Niall. We've been speaking with South African writer Niall Reddy, who wrote the AfricaIsACountry.com article, A Terrifying Vision of South Africa's Future. You can follow Niall on Twitter at @Red_Niall, and you can find some of Niall's writing at the Alternative Information and Development Center website, aidc.org.za. One last question for you now, and as we do with all of our guests, our final question is what we call the question from hell, the question we hate to ask, you might hate to answer, our audience is going to hate the response. So you you conclude that a final way that we may emerge better off through all of this is if the crisis jolts the left in the same way it has elites. The riots have given us a terrifying vision of South Africa's future if the current trajectory is not arrested. If we don't find a way to channel popular discontent into the building of mass progressive movements, then it will instead fuel anarchy, nativism, and inevitably authoritarianism. How close is South Africa with ANC leadership already acting in an authoritarian fashion?
I would actually say not that close. We went some way down that road with Zuma, and in particular through his attempts to gain direct personal control over the security agencies, etc., of the country. But even there, he was setting things up for a more serious authoritarian turn. He didn't fundamentally get there. He didn't undermine the constitutional order. He didn't usurp the independence of the judiciary. He didn't totally undermine the rule of law. And thankfully, it seems he didn't make successful inroads into politicizing the military, which is one crucial way in which, thankfully, I think South Africa is, to some degree, a little bit more insulated from a kind of full-blown authoritarian turn. Under Ramaphosa, the trend has been actually away from all of that. It's been towards, trying to reestablish the impartiality and the independence of the state and to undergird and support the constitutional order in the country. And so in that sense, I think South Africa hasn't joined this kind of third wave of authoritarianism, which is sweeping the globe. Whether it does so or not depends on ultimately how all of these current political battles play out. So one way in which this might be the reality that we're confronting quite soon is if somehow this RET faction recomposes itself and manages to successfully challenge Ramaphosa for power within the ANC, because I think they would drive that kind of agenda. I think almost the more likely thing is that we're going to continue to see a disintegration of the ANC and this faction being pushed out of it. And we're going to start to see forms of authoritarian populism emerging outside of the ANC and perhaps taking forms that mirror a little bit more what's happening in other parts of the country. So I think one of the weird reasons that South Africa has ultimately been a little bit protected from this wave of authoritarianism is that the populist factions in the country do not have the support of big business in the way that they do in other countries. Because we have this strange post-colonial society in which there are major cleavages within the elite and the middle class, it's meant that the kind of class alliances and coalitions that have supported populist takeovers in other parts of the country, so middle-class driven populism, as you've seen in India and Brazil, for example, and other places where the elites and middle class have aligned very closely, have not been possible in South Africa. And so we haven't gone. South Africa is, in this sense, kind of exceptional and might be something that, despite other conditions that would seem to predispose us towards this kind of authoritarianism, like this very entrenched social crisis, might mean that we don't actually take that route. And at this stage, it just is very impossible to predict anything, because it all hinges on the question of what happens when the ANC's hegemony finally decomposes and breaks down. And this is just something that we haven't, the whole post-apartheid period has been characterized by overwhelming, untouchable electoral dominance of the ANC. And we just don't know what the political map starts to look like when that eventually comes to an end, as it has to.
Niall, thank you. So, by the way, that was an excellent answer to a question from Hell. Thank you so much for being on our show. Niall Reddy wrote the AfricaIsACountry.com article, A Terrifying Vision of South Africa's Future. And you can follow Niall on Twitter at @Red_Niall. Thank you so much for being on the show. This has been a very enlightening conversation. I truly appreciate it.
Thank you so much. This has been a great conversation. Really appreciate it.
All right, take care.
You've been listening to a This Is Hell interview. For more interview hell and to support the show, visit thisishell.com.